Hello, my name is Kevin Pearies, and today we'll be going over fiber fundamentals. So, this is a first in a series of short videos that talk about the different technologies that we're working with today. And today we've decided to talk about fiber fundamentals, and so let's kick that off. So, basically, just a quick description of fiber. So, fiber is essentially an optical conduit, right? So, it carries the light signal down the fiber. There's some sort of a detector on the far end that decodes that information, and then that gives you your bit stream, right? Your ones and zeros, and that's your data rate. So that's essentially what it is. So we're transitioning from copper into fiber for many of our deployments today. So if you look at the fiber geometry itself, down here in the bottom left, you can see how we have the core of the fiber right here in the middle. And then wrapped around that is going to be the cladding, and then around that is the coating. Of course, there's more to the cable than that, but that's what we're going to focus on today. So when we're looking at the end of the fiber here, from the end phase perspective, most of the signal travels right here in the core. This is between 8 and 10 microns for standard single mode fiber. And then wrapped around that, of course, is going to be the cladding. And the cladding sits at about 125 microns. And then wrapped around that is going to be the coating, which is out to 250 microns. We are seeing versions of the fiber that are down to 200 microns for really high count, small cable deployments. And so that's what we're seeing right now from a cable geometry perspective. Looking at the actual fiber types, there's single mode and multi-mode. We're primarily dealing with single mode fiber in most of our deployments, like fiber to the home, Metro Ethernet, point-to-point networks, those types of things. We see multi-mode inter-rack, inter-bay typically, maybe some campus environments themselves. And of course, you need to take all that fiber and package it into some sort of a cable. And so this could be high count, low count. It could be gel filled, dry, aerial, microfiber to be blown into smaller ducts. It could be breakout cords, patch cords, pre-terminated trunks. So the fiber manufacturer makes the fiber themselves, and then the cable manufacturer will decide how to package that. And just to give you an idea of the types of density that we're looking at, so a lot of the new smaller form factor connectors, and multi-fiber connections. From your perspective, you might see them in like an OptiTip connector within a fiber to the home deployment. In some areas, you might see it in the new multi-fiber push lock. So these are kind of ribbonized connectors. But I really wanted to show this slide just to show you that we are getting into some really high counts. And we can get as much as 6,336 fibers into a 1U rack, which is really, really impressive if you think about it. So fiber is really the direction we're going. Then, of course, now that we have the glass and we have it wrapped into a cable package, we need to put a signal on it. And so that's what we start dealing with wavelengths. And so shorter wavelengths, like you might see with 1310 nanometers, longer wavelengths like 1550 nanometers are what we typically see quite a bit. Now, if we're talking about, GPON deployment, we're looking at downstream 1490 nanometers. And then upstream 1310. So this is typical for GPON. And then as you transition into 10 gig PON, like XGS PON, your downstream is going to be 1577 nanometers. And then your upstream is going to be 1270 nanometers. Right? And of course, as you adjust the frequency, you can increase your bandwidth. So a lot of this stuff you learned back in the electrical and copper days there, right? So a lot of that science is still relevant here today. And so when we talk about those wavelengths, these are essentially the lengths of the individual waves. Sometimes we'll call them colors. So that's why, if you look at a red VFL, you're looking at about, 640 to 680 nanometers for most of those little red light VFLs. And so that's a visible wavelength. So we're dealing with primarily the infrared. So if you notice it, that's to the right of red is infrared, to the left of violet is ultraviolet. Right, so we're typically dealing with infrared wavelengths there. So your 1310s, your 1550s, those types of things. And so as that signal travels down the fiber, we need to know the speed. So we measure the speed. We call it the index of refraction, or IOR. The speed of light going through a vacuum or in space has a 1.0 index of refraction. Right, so that's about 300,000 kilometers per second, roughly. As that signal or light enters air, it slows down a little. As it enters water, it slows down even more. As it enters fiber, it slows down, and as it enters glass, it slows down. So we measure the speed of light within the particular material. If we know how fast the signal is moving within that type of material, then we know what the speed is. And if we know what the speed is and how long it took for it to get there and back, that gives us distance. So we do that using index of refraction. That's how we measure the light within the glass. And so this is the value that we have here for standard single mode fiber, which is what you use in most of your deployments. And how does that signal stay within the glass? Total internal reflection. So basically the light bounces back and forth inside the core, and it bounces off the cladding is what it does there. So that's kind of what this light over here is doing. So if you input light at a specific angle, it'll reflect off of the surface of the water. This is total internal reflection. If you get that angle wrong, if you have the signal coming in from a steeper angle here, it would refract off into the air, right? And so it's important to keep the geometry of that glass to maintain total internal reflection. And as that signal travels down the fiber, it starts to attenuate. There's two types of attenuation. Intrinsic. So that means this is attenuation internal to the fiber itself, created during manufacturing and specifications. So as the fiber gets longer, it starts to absorb more of the signal, right? So the signal starts to attenuate as the fiber gets longer. And it's typically about 0.2 dB per kilometer is what we see. And it also starts to scatter the signal a little bit as it travels as well. And so this is intrinsic attenuation. There's also extrinsic or external attenuation. This is caused by pinches in the fiber, connectors, splices, and those things. So most connectors, you want 0.5 dB or better. And most splices, depending on which group you're in, could be anywhere from 0.1 or higher, right, dB per splice. And so these are some things to look at. And it's really important to minimize this attenuation because for every 3 dB of loss, we lose 50% of our incoming signal, right? So if you have a span that's 20 dB, which is not unusual for PON, and then another fiber on the exact same cable is 23 dB, this is 50% difference in power. So it's important to understand how that affects it. And so understanding the fiber geometry and how the glass works is really important to know because the future of high-speed bandwidth is fiber. It's the present, really. But going forward, it's going to stay there for a long time. We talk about high-speed internet and stuff like that, but conversations about Wi-Fi and wireless technologies, none of that can happen without fiber. Fiber enables all of our bandwidth in the world. And so without it, we wouldn't have satellite transmission speeds for data. We wouldn't have cell phone speeds that we have today. It's all driven by fiber. When we're looking at fiber, we're essentially looking at higher bandwidth, more symmetrical speeds, longer transmission distance, without the degradation, and much more reliable. In fact, I always say, if you don't pinch the fiber, don't bend the fiber to the bend radius, and you clean the ends, more often than not, it'll work, right? If it doesn't, it's usually an engineering issue of some sort. And so it's very scalable with higher speeds. So as we transition to newer technologies, fiber is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. With that, my name is Kevin Pearies. Thank you very much.